Old Manusctipt of Taraka. Part 1. Roland was sitting alone by the table with 3 mugs filled with a bitter, smoked beer. Awful taste poisoned his throat with every sip, and he couldn't help but wonder, why not order a simple jug of water instead? He figured out that this beer was just a part of his service as Wilbur and Rachel are. Without this awful beer, quests for Auriel would simply not be happening. He couldn't explain why, but he knew this to be true. Deep inside. He was actually quite surprised not seeing Rachel already waiting for him by the same table they always sat by in the dirtiest tavern of the poorest district of the city of Auriel. He was fearing the worst. He finally told her to find the information she was incapable of reaching. Wilbur was late too, but this was no surprise. To Roland, it always seemed that he had a dozen things more important to do than their actual job. He wondered what would happen if all of them would fail this time. Would they simply be not paid for their job or get completely expelled from service for Auriel? He couldn't let that happen. No matter what, he needed to work for him. He needed to dwell deeper. And yet, he dwelled deeper and didn't feel closer to finding out the truth even a single bit. He took a look at his greatsword leaning on the edge of the weak wooden table. His sacred sword, enchanted with a blessing of... "Damn you," he whispered to himself and took another sip. It was even worse than the previous one. He spotted Rachel coming into the tavern. She bumped into some big guy with an axe on his back larger than herself. "Blow off!" she hissed at him while he tried to find the little creature that insulted him in the first place, for she was so small he never even noticed her. "You got this?" Roland asked at the very moment she arrived, placing a pile of maps on a table. "This is bullshit!" she hissed again and grabbed her mug of beer. She took 3 deep sips and put the mug down with bitterness on her face that seemed almost painful. Roland did not respond, only nodded sadly. "How can we be sure that this place even exists?" she said pretentiously. "Auriel is certain that..." "How can we be certain of a place that no book in the last 2,000 years describes in the first place?" She was totally out of control. A feeling of anger and embarrassment was so strong that she couldn't handle it. As far as Roland was concerned, Rachel was able to dig out even the hardest and the best hidden information. Basically, anything. Excluding details about Roland's past, of course. "It is not possible!" It was Wilbur that just came in, dropped few heavy books on a table, and also took his mug of beer, pouring into himself a bitter substance that made him grimace. "So, none of you had any luck, then? We don't know where this book might be." "Worse," Wilbur said in a calmer tone while taking his seat by the table. Rachel did the same. "We don't even know if it exists. In the whole history of anything even vaguely related to magic, there is not a single word mentioning it. Everything that I know about this tome is from you. Auriel never told you anything else." Roland shook his head silently. "Great!" Rachel exclaimed. "Now what?" "It seems to me that there is only a hard way," Roland said sadly, leaning lazily on the back of his chair. His back hurt, he realized. He wondered if he's getting too old for all this. "And the hard way is?" "The myth, of course." He replies as if it would be crystal clear what he means. "Explain it to us, Roland," Wilbur said politely, but impatiently. Roland took a deep breath and started. Auriel wants to find a hidden place where the book titled The Manusctipt of Taraka is hidden, he stated. Auriel couldn't find anything about this book either, or about those that guard it, or the city it's supposed to be in. That's why he hired us. So, how does he know about the manuscript in the first place? From some bard's song? Wilbur said, frowning. It is not a song, Roland said harshly. It's a myth, a legend. That is, most likely, why nobody ever went to look for them. No one would go and look for something that, just as well, might be a simple fairy tale. But Auriel is convinced that this is more than that, and he pays well. Impossible, Rachel guffawed. So how are we going to chase this myth? Roland took a crumpled piece of paper out of his pocket. Wilbur and Rachel had their own copies with them to help them find some information in their own sources, and they also took it out. 3 identical sheets of paper were lying before them, and Roland cleared his throat. Let's focus on the story itself and find out where it might lead us. And he started to read aloud. The last words of King Auriel were to be written on the last few remaining pages of the Manusctipt of Taraka, which was a full compendium of ancient knowledge. While the city was besieged by the forces of blood and iron, while the last hope died with the defenders and walls crumbled, King Auriel sat in his throne room with his scribe Mercutio. Massive tome was so large that it had to be placed on a pedestal, for no hands were strong enough to hold it. As darkness consumed the city and madness spread across the streets, the last scrap of the last page was filled with King Auriel's last words that were to mark the end of his people and the beginning of the new age that would forget about them completely. As he cared for the memory of the nation that was to be forgotten, he refused to run from the invaders. Instead, he took his sword and got up from his throne while the last gate fell and the cloud of blood filled the air. The last of the guard, 2 knights of names lost in time, went with Mercutio to drag the ancient tome to safety so that, one day, their history might be discovered and memory of their glory restored, for the manuscript held all the record about their civilization. As the king's blood soaked in the black carpet of his chamber, as the last of men fell before the impossible force, Mercutio and 2 knights escaped, keeping the tome safe. They were the Sentinels, the last guardians of the old ways, monks of the ancient truth. They hid in the caverns so bright with the light of their faith that the force of blood and iron could not find them. And centuries passed, and millennia of books were written, and these caverns were never found. Yet Sentinels prevailed, and they kept guard of the King Auriel's and his ancestors' ancient kingdom, ready to give it out to those that have the will to listen, and protect it from the eyes blindfolded by darkness. Doesn't sound like a children's story to me, Rachel commented abruptly. Good, replied Roland, because it is not supposed to be. It's a myth. Not really, Wilbur interrupted. More like notes made by Auriel investigating this myth. It might be the case that the original story is lost in time just as well. And yet, Paladin said slowly, that's all we got to find the book. Notes on a story that might not exist, mentioning a king of a nation nobody knows about, and some book wrote and guarded by people so ancient and mysterious that no book or scroll described them. Is Auriel certain that it's worth his effort and money? Wilbur sounded puzzled. That surprised Roland, for he predicted that Wilbur would be the one intrigued by the idea, given his curiosity towards magic and knowledge. But he was very skeptical, even a little bit apathic. Speaking of which, how much is that going to be? That was Rachel. If we get the manuscript for him, Auriel is willing to pay a lot, Roland said rather quietly. Which is? Rachel hurried him. 50,000 gold coins. Roland let the silence sink in the air after uttering those words, and then he added, for each of us. No fucking way, Rachel whispered. Nobody has that kind of money to just give away, Mage commented, frowning. That's true, their leader pointed out. First, we will have to work for it, and, as both of you observed, the task is, indeed, almost impossible. They sat in silence for a while, occasionally sipping their disgusting dense beer with their eyes fixed on a table. A lot of people were coming in and out of the inn. Some guy screamed something in Elvish that made Wilbur shake his head. The two other fellows were just about to fight over an opinion regarding the color of the carpet in the hard quarters of the temple guard. It was Wilbur that broke this intellectual limbo. Where do we start? Nobody heard about this Ishel dude and his fair castle, Rachel started, so it seems like they got wiped out by whoever they fought with. Maybe they remained. I mean, the invaders. Blood and iron, Roland said to himself. That can be anything. We know that it is not our people that got rid of him, Mage said. It was not the Empire, because in this way there would be a record of war with such a nation. It had to be some invaders that came in, slaughtered the people, and came back on their ships, leaving the kingdom depopulated. Some of those people might have joined other nations, but their own culture never survived. But then, there should be at least ruins of their city. It's not possible that it burned to the ground after all. Rachel sounded puzzled. And even if it would, we'd know about such place, Paladin pointed out while stretching his back on a chair. Not necessarily. Wilbur's eyes lit up. Not if the city was rebuilt, renamed, and claimed by the others. But in this way, you're assuming that it was us that killed them, and you just said that it is not possible, Roland pointed out. It is not only us that inhabits this land, Roland. Empire might be united, but there are some tribes that do not perceive themselves as part of it, and some of them are holding into castles and strongholds older than any of our cities. Older even than Shorel, which is considered the oldest city of the Empire. You're not talking about the orcs, are you? Rachel frowned. Maybe, he replied, but far north there are other tribes that inhabit lands so savage and cold that Empire only claims to possess this land while, in practice, no human being ever was able to even enter this land and come back alive. Or far south nomads from sand cities, Roland pointed out, but it does not help. We can't go everywhere to look for this forgotten city. But do we have to? Rachel asked genuinely. We only need to find the book, not dig out the whole fucking kingdom. They're supposed to be huddled somewhere in a cave or something, right? Those caverns are likely to be in the vicinity of their capital, Paladin noticed. They wouldn't be able to escape far if the city was besieged. Blood and iron consumed the city with darkness and spread madness in the streets. Could it be necromancers? Wilbur pondered. The whole city? That never happened in history. Roland was frowning while uttering those words. Mentioning necromancers definitely angered him. There was nothing odd about it, since light magic represented by followers of Cole and dark magic of necromancers were always two forces opposing each other. Or did it? Wilbur looked at him from above his back. That's the part of the history we might not know. And what history do we truly know? Rachel squealed. The farthest our knowledge goes back is the life of the first emperor. Cole's fanatics conquered the whole continent, but no book describes what was before them. Barbarians unable to write, Roland grimaced. There is no written history before the Empire because the Empire brought writing to this land in the first place. This myth suggests otherwise, Flesh Mage proposed. Empire wouldn't destroy other civilization. Roland was angered. The only reason it came was to bring light into darkness. There was no culture and no writing at the moment of the first emperor conquering the land. There was certainly none after he succeeded, Rachel said quietly. My kin, elves of the distant Isles, were before the Empire, and they were doing pretty good without their interference. Wilbur was the only one that remained calm in this conversation. But they had no interest in whatever was happening on the continent. Or, at least, not all of them did. What are you suggesting? Roland asked suspiciously. Distant Isles is a place filled with disdain towards humankind. That is what my people are, unfortunately, but not all of us were like that. There was a group of magicians, or rather monks, that did move into the continent and remained here to study the land. If that's so, how did we never hear about them? Rachel noticed. Because they cared about never being heard of, Wilbur answered slowly. They came in here, before the Empire, and hid from the outside world in their self-sustaining monastery. From there, they watched the world and kept the record of all there was to see. If anyone might know anything about some mysterious nation from the age before the Empire, it would be them. Sounds good to me. How do we find them? Rachel asked with her arms crossed on her chest. Oh, Mage exclaimed. I have no clue. Brief silence filled the room until their leader broke it harshly with his voice. Are you serious? Absolutely, he responded. I know that they arrived here and I'm confident that they survived and they still keep a record of our history. But the reason they're still here is that they were unable to be found. Great, Paladin responded resentfully. Now what? In my home country, they are being referred to as moths. It is because they live in darkness and follow the light of knowledge on their own. As they certainly manage to hide from humans, I should be able to detect the source of power they use to sustain themselves. Sounds easy enough, Rachel commented. But if that's so, if all that it takes is their fellow pointy ears to find them, why no other mage ever discovered them? As I said, Wilbur finished his beer with a bitter grimace. Distant Isles have no interest in Midland humans. I doubt that anyone was ever interested in trying to find them in the first place. Not a single elf, at least. Why would that be? Paladin was genuinely surprised. If what you said is true, they keep an immense amount of knowledge. All true. Wilbur got up. But, well... He did not finish, but Rachel understood. Knowledge about apes, she said with a vicious smile. What do you mean? Roland frowned. That's what we are to them. Mindless apes, not worthy of attention. Isn't true, Wilbur? Rachel looked very proud of herself, but Mage did not find interest in responding to it at all. I know where we can start. Come with me. It is going to be a long journey. It was cold and windy. No, wait. It was impossibly freezing and a hurricane haunted the mountains. The wind never got better. It always blew in its full strength. The same with cold that cloaked bodies of 3 heroes in its grave-like embrace. It started to feel like a grave, at least that's what I felt looking at them, shuddering under thick fur blankets. Rachel and Roland sat without a word, and Wilbur investigated the walls, looking for magic runes that would mark the entrance to the Moth Sanctuary. "We still have some?" Rachel muttered, not sure if Paladin will hear her. He did not move for a few seconds, and a dreadful thought came through her mind that he might have frozen to death. But he moved slightly and threw her a small package of bacon. She ate a ton of it while they were out there. It was possible that she was responsible for consuming most of it, but she couldn't help it. She always ate fat when in freezing cold, if she had anything to eat in the first place, of course. "That's pointless," Mage shouted while sitting down and coating himself with the fur of a mountain tiger. These were expensive furs, but each of them would be capable of driving said tigers all the way to extinction if they would wish to have skins of all of them, and they still would remain rich afterwards. The impossible income they had from Auriel made them richer than some of the lords were. And yet, cold was piercing them the same, as if they would have nothing, and wind did not care for their possessions just as well. Rachel wanted to cheer the mage in some way, but she couldn't find much vigor and will to live in herself to start with. But there was something objectively good that she could offer, so she did. He looked at her hand, now held to him with a small package filled with smoked meat inside. He ignored her and lay down, turning his back to her, attempting to go to sleep. "Suit yourself." She shrugged and kept chewing on her favorite piece of meat. How down the person has to be not to appreciate a piece of juicy bacon, especially in this cold, wretched place. She couldn't answer this question because she couldn't imagine being that down ever in her life, even in her darkest moments. And it all despite the fact that her past was far more unbearable and filled with suffering than any of her companions. Roland joined the mage in sleep, and Rachel did the same. As all of them lay down, falling asleep, the same thoughts haunted the minds of each of them. That maybe it would be better to just stay on this hard, cold ground and simply fall. Fall asleep maybe, but the sleep that does not end. Sleep that does not lead to waking up in this place again, struggling with cold and looking for a door that might, as well, just not exist at all. "And we're running out of bacon," Rachel thought, and that got her down even more than Wilbur was. They got up in the morning and had some traveler's bread. Wilbur argued really hard that elves invented it, while Rachel was very offended by such statement, hence her grandmother had her own very special recipe for such bread that was supposed to be older than the Empire itself, which would only prove that this bread was being baked in the Midland way before elves ever visited this realm. Roland tried to make a small fire, but once again his effort was futile. It was way too windy, and he couldn't find a place that would cover him sufficiently enough for fragile flames to survive. As they were having their breakfast, Wilbur really took his time while eating, chewing every single bit extremely slowly, lost in thoughts. Nobody was hurrying him though. Roland did not speak for at least 2 days, and Rachel left rather down too. Anyway, their job was only to sit mindlessly at every spot Wilbur was bringing them to while he was searching for an entrance. With the last bit of his bread, he spoke finally. "One last shot," he said. "If today I will not find the entrance, we'll be forced to go back to Charles." And at that point, mute Paladin found his voice again. Voice strong and filled with anger made Rachel jump. "And what is that supposed to mean?" he shouted viciously. "All those days only for us to come back defeated? You said that entrance is here and finding it would be easy for someone of your kind." "Because that's what it was for me before." Wilbur's famous patience was gone. He was mad, not angry, at least not in the way that Roland was. There was much resentment in his words. "I spent years training in those mountains, and magic could have been sensed in the air so heavily that it was difficult to breathe. I don't know why it is not there anymore." "What if they are simply not in here anymore? They might have moved or died," Rachel pointed out. "Magic could still be sensed for years, maybe even decades. Their presence in here for millennia must have left a mark that is difficult to get rid of with a flick of a finger." "What do you plan to do if you will fail to find the runes, Wilbur?" Roland sounded a little bit calmer this time, but only on the outside. His voice shuddered from anger. "You just want to give up?" "Of course not," he riposted, "but I'd rather spend my time researching the subject in a place that will not kill me with its cold blows as this is attempting to." "If you need rest, we could always find the monastery you took your lessons in," Rachel said in a caring voice. "I'm afraid that this might not be possible anymore," he said quietly, looking at his crossed legs. "Maybe there is something preventing you from feeling this magic?" Roland asked after a brief silence. "What do you mean?" Mage raised his head and frowned, looking at the night. "You could feel it while learning and meditating in here, and now it's been years since the time your mind might be clouded." "My mind is perfectly fine," he hissed. "It's not that. I need to think." He grabbed his head tightly. "Some things can be found while not being looked for," Roland said suddenly. "Our desire is a wall that prevents us from grasping what we want." "What are you suggesting?" Wilbur let his head go and looked at him angrily. "That you're supposed to feel the presence of magic, Wilbur. However you're doing it, that is a process separate from thinking. If you cloud yourself with too many thoughts, if you worry, you might not be able to sense it anymore. You said that you could feel it in the past, when your mind was still." "What is this nonsense?" he hissed at his leader again. "I am not going to listen to this religious bullshit." "Just shut up and fucking relax!" Rachel blew off unexpectedly. Wilbur got up and went on his way. Roland got up and gave Rachel a look filled with disappointment. "Hey!" she exclaimed. "Isn't what you meant?" "There is a reason why in our language some things can be phrased in a more sophisticated manner, Rachel." She gave him an angry look and got up too. They took their stash and followed the mage on a narrow road leading on the side of the mountain. Wilbur found 3 other spots to lay his hands on. He murmured, searched, and swore a lot. At that time, they ran out of bacon too, and it was not for the reason that either knight or mage was hungry. The 3rd spot that Wilbur found happened to be not exactly right as well. It was getting dark already, so he sighed and said in a resigned tone, "I'm done. Let's go back." Roland nodded and approached his companion. As he grabbed his arm gently, or As gently as big metal hand grabbing you is capable of doing so, he said with a smile on his face, while looking him in the eye. That's alright, Wilbur. You did a great job. We'll come back and sort it out. Don't worry about it. He sighed and attempted to smile too. Roland put a tiger fur on his back and they went on their way down. Somewhere along the way, while they still were quite high, Paladin stopped and turned around to the others. That's a wonderful sunset. Do you mind us stopping in here for a few minutes? I want to look at it before we'll go back to this filthy town. Rachel and Wilbur looked at each other surprised, but they nodded in agreement. Then Knight sat on a ledge with his legs crossed and hands laying gently on his thighs. Rachel sat on his right, swinging her legs, and Wilbur on his left. All gazed into the scenery that was incredible indeed. A big part of the kingdom was visible from that spot. It was incredibly cold and the wind did try to blow them off, but there was some peace in sitting just like that, gazing into the forests and little towns growing from out of this vast land. It is beautiful, indeed, Wilbur said, and Roland harshed him by placing his pointing finger on his lips. It's even better without any commentary included, he stated. And they sat like that for a while. It was definitely longer than mentioned by Roland, a few minutes, but none of them felt like bragging about keep moving forward. They didn't because they dwelt in peace and beauty that was far greater than them, and its magnificent wholeness embraced them so warmly that no cold could pierce its way through. Then it happened. Roland's plan worked perfectly well. Wilbur jumped upright on his legs, as if burned by the ground, and ran into the wall. Rachel looked at him and then at Roland, only to see him smiling. Wilbur kept murmuring while searching the wall with his hands, and then, suddenly, he took 2 steps back, grabbed his staff, and raised it high while exclaiming some words in Elvish. And there it was. Wall shuddered and split in half, creating a perfectly rectangular entrance into a dark cave. Ha! Wilbur screamed in joy. I got it! That's it! This is it! You're a genius! Rachel whispered to Roland, that said nothing. He approached the mage, wanting to congratulate him, but he, to the surprise of both him and the little assassin, jumped right to him and hugged him strongly. Thank you, Roland, he whispered while letting him go. Thank you. No need to thank me, Wilbur, he said gently, while sheeting out his sword cloak with light magic that cut through the darkness of the corridor. You done sucking each other's dicks? Rachel said as grumpily as she could, while covering her smile, for she was just as happy as they were. Let's find those filthy elves. Rachel with her torch, Roland with the light of his blade, and Wilbur with his enchanted orb went inside the mountain. It was there where the moth priests were to be found, and, hopefully, some information about the mysterious Manusctipt of Taraka as well. Corridor was long and filled with darkness that made them feel a little uneasy. Of course, their light cut through it almost effortlessly, but nonetheless, the whole place had this nagging, claustrophobic atmosphere. At least no spiders this time, Rachel said quietly. I wouldn't expect any, Wilbur responded. Moths separated themselves from the world quite firmly. Not even spiders were to find them deep in these mountains. How are they supposed to know anything about the world that they are so excited about if they never go out? Rachel asked genuinely. They're mages, That was a classical Wilbur's response, but he continued. There's only so much you can see with your own eyes. Only so much you can experience. That wouldn't be enough for them. I bet that they found a way to see this world in a way more efficient way with the usage of their magic. We'll find out soon enough, I suppose. Corridor came to an end, and they found themselves in a large chamber. There were some benches, chairs, and tables scattered around. Below their feet, they also noticed something that might have been a carpet, but in its distant past, for all furniture was covered in dust so thick that it looked like a great snow. It's been ages since any of it was used or cleaned. Well, Rachel put her hand on her hips, at least we know that they were here. Wilbur pushed forward without commenting on it. Other small chambers were attached to the bigger one, but all cluttered with unused objects, some of unclear origin or purpose. It did look like the whole place was abandoned for hundreds of years. Even elves can die of some sort of sickness, right? Rachel asked Roland quietly. They don't grow old and don't get sick, he said in a serious tone. And there is only one sickness that rots their heart, and eventually kills them with no mercy. And what is that? Crave for knowledge. Moth's sanctuary wasn't that big after all. They arrived in the last chamber, the biggest one in the whole complex, and it was there they found their answers. There was a pool, filled with glimmering, blue like a sky in a summer afternoon, dense liquid. Looked a lot like water, but smelled horrible. Some light was emerging from the bottom of it, which source was difficult to determine. And in this pool, on its surface, there were certain objects floating like abandoned logs of wood in the lake. 4 feet long creatures, all completely hairless, with little hands in their upper bodies and no legs. Their snail-like skin glimmered in the light. There was perfect silence in the room as they floated mindlessly, all facing the ceiling. The ceiling. What? Rachel faced Wilbur, who was gazing up with his mouth open. She also looked up, and there, images of indescribable colors filled with unimaginable depth, as if objects of the ordinary world were, comparing to them, merely labels, child's paintings. Images of vast lands covered with juicy green grass, bright, warm light of the sun. Also, deserts drowning in golden sand. Each grain of that sand, every single grain in that desert, were so different from each other, unique and beautiful. And there was a castle rising into the sky, conquering the world. The dense blood of slaughtered humans and creatures laughed at the bar. Some poor girl getting raped in a dark alley. A deer is dying in the moss, covered in mud. Roland pulled both of them and threw their bodies against the ground. They grunted as he shook them off. "Wake up!" he shouted. "Are you alright?" "It was before you fucking assaulted me, you bastard!" Rachel torched the back of her head. There was some blood, but not too much. "So that's how they see it," Wilbur murmured, covering his eyes with both hands, as if trying to touch the images he just witnessed. "They live the world as every being, as every grain of grass and piece of wood. They see it with the eyes of God." "What happened to them?" Roland looked at the bodies floating aimlessly, gazing into the glowing cloud of images above them. "Are they your kin?" "Yeah," Wilbur whispered. "It appears so. Experiencing this world, crave to know all that is taking place, consume them completely." Wow, you guys are such perverts. That is the next level of stalking, if you ask me. Rachel lifted herself up from the ground and held her hand towards Wilbur. He rejected her help and got up by himself. So, if they lay in here as long as you said, Paladin continued, it means that they witnessed what happened to the ancient city of Taraka. Is that right? I suppose so, Wilbur pondered, but this knowledge is gone. What do you mean? Roland raised his eyebrows. They are not interested in preserving knowledge. They only wish to experience it. Live it. They consume and does not share with others. Nobody said anything to these words. Instead, all three of them were standing on the edge of the pool, gazing into what was left of curious elf mages. But why would they come all the way in here to watch their creepy show? Rachel asked quietly. Most likely for power saving. They lay in the middle of the land, they observe. That's quite a hassle, she noticed. All this stuff, furniture, did they bring it all with themselves? Wilbur suddenly looked at her. His eyes were glimmering. You're right, he said. They did not discover this possibility at first. At first, they set themselves a camp. They lived and walked as we do. They observed with human eyes that craved for so much more. And if so, maybe then, in their early years, they were interested in keeping records of what was happening. Few of them must have kept some journals, Roland said. Let's search the other rooms. And maybe there will be some notes on how they built that contraption and description of what it truly is. Wilbur thought, but did not dare to say it out loud. Searching through their stuff was not easy. There was plenty of junk scattered around. There were books too, but in terrible shape. They needed to be lifted with great care, or pages were turning into dust. Wilbur found their book collection rather disappointing. A lot of academic literature was describing the theory of magic and basic alchemy. Books that even the most experienced mages should keep around in case of need or referring to any of them, but he counted on finding something unusual instead. That did not happen, but at last, Rachel screamed, I got it! They found her in a little room with 3 broken beds inside. She was sitting on the floor with a candle she found, reading a small book that appeared to be a journal they were looking for. Look, she said to both of them while they sat next to each other. She pointed out on the last page of it. Others are very anxious about making notes of any kind regarding our project, and I share their point of view fully. In the end, none of us would wish anyone to enter the stream and disturb our visions. But there is one thing that worries me deeply, and I feel that I need to write it down, for the history might not preserve this fact, due to the peculiarity of the event itself. There are wars in this land, as they always were and will always be, but recently a new player entered the game. Force of ruthless power, blood and iron that's so inhuman that no human heart can comprehend. Taraka and their king Auriel are to be blamed for not being cautious enough, but their future fate is way too dark for any being to experience. We all saw Cloak of Darkness embracing the land, suffocating it with its poisonous power. We all saw Taraka falling into the black realm of unseen. We all saw what will remain hidden. The whole kingdom, with its capital as the last city that tried to persevere, lives in the unseen now. Vast land filled with rich jungles took its place, and we already saw other people building their own city in the place of it, not willing to remember that anything ever existed there before. Remembering will only draw the darkness back to them. That's my last note in this journal, for we need to go now. Visions await us. Life itself calls our names. That explains a lot, Wilbur said after a moment of silence. Really? Rachel squealed. So why don't you explain it all to us? Because to me, it's all mumbling of a madman. This man was mad, of course, Mage replied patiently, but it explains why history does not know the city of Taraka. It was taken from the physical realm to the realm that this elf calls unseen. And what is that supposed to mean? Roland asked quietly. I don't know, he replied, but I see a lot of similarities in this note to the myth that Auriel provided for us. Blood, iron, darkness, you see when you don't see, all useless shit, Rachel grumbled. Maybe, Wilbur got up, or maybe not. This way or the other, we know much more now. We know that the other city grew in the place of this one. City in the jungle, Rachel pointed out. Any ideas? Oh, no, Mage interrupted her. Most likely there's no jungle around this city in the present. Remember, millennia passed. Since these events took place, there might be a desert now, or a river coming through, or even the whole city might be underwater. There's no way to know. Those people knew Taraka and realized the black flame that consumed it. Paladin got up too, shaking off the dust from himself. Even if they agreed to not remember such events for whatever reason, there must have been some records relating to raising the city in the first place. Why would they do that? She got up too, but not bothered by dust. They were cowards that chose to forget. Because all men deep inside know what is right, and something must have screamed inside them to do the right thing. Their divine essence, the light of Cole himself, must have shined through their clouded minds, one way or the other. In what form? She got irritated. I really think that you should put aside all this impractical religious bullshit. In form of a name, for example. The mage smiled to himself and covered his face with both hands, as if in shame. The name? Both Roland and Rachel asked almost simultaneously. That's unbelievable, he said to himself. I wonder if that is some kind of Auriel's joke on us, if he knew in the first place, of course. What the fuck are you talking about? Rachel exploded. They built a city, and the name of the city referred to its foundations. And, in a way, this city was built on darkness. Of course. Roland got it now and also smiled to himself. Rachel was about to shout at him too, but suddenly she understood it just as well. Shorel, she whispered. Shaw, meaning darkness, and Rel, or rising. The city of Taraka exists simultaneously with the city of Shorel, on the same ground, at the same time, in two different dimensions. Wow! Rachel exclaimed. That's frightening. Yes, Roland admitted. We drink our smoked beer exactly in the place of eternal suffering of souls sentenced to hell by forces of blood and iron. I really don't want to ask that, but I think we have to, Rachel said slowly. Yes, Wilbur answered before she was able to ask. There is a way to access this dark realm, and I know this way. Let's come back now. What about them? Roland said with a little hesitation. We'll seal the entrance and allow them to keep dreaming. Why? Rachel was surprised. Why not? They do not harm anyone. and their bodies are slowly changing and will decay in a few millennia or so. Doesn't it disturb you? What do you mean? Wilbur frowned. They're your own people, she hissed. You don't want to help them. He looked into her eyes with sadness. It was Roland that answered. All elves live for themselves, he uttered slowly. They do not interfere. They do not care for each other. The last sentence turned Wilbur's cheeks red, but he did not comment on that. Instead, all three of them were on their way out of this cavern. Wilbur sealed the entrance, and they proceeded down the mountain. Back home, but also so far away from home than any of them could comprehend. I am ordering water. Don't be ridiculous, Roland. You look like a fool. Will bring unnecessary attention. Wilbur responded to him while they were taking their seats at the table in the tavern located in the poor district of the city of Auriel. I will not stand it anymore, Wilbur. I would prefer to fight a legion of those monsters from Druid's hut rather than to have another mug. Roland. He grabbed his hand gently. Look at me and listen carefully. He looked deep into his eyes. They were blue and deep, filled with wisdom and compassion. His lips opened up gently, and words flew from his mouth like a gentle blow of wind in a summer morning. Don't be a pussy. He took his hand back rapidly, and at that time Rachel came in. You guys having your gay things again? She threw, not even looking at them. I don't care as long as I don't have to watch this. Then she took a look at the table. If you did not order yet, I'll get us those mugs filled with diarrhea. Wilbur nodded and then took a look around. He nodded too, bitterly, with a bit of hesitation. While Rachel came back to the table and placed the mugs in front of her companions, they were in the middle of a very hot discussion that must have started very shortly after she left. I don't really have any connection in the temple anymore, Roland tried to persuade Wilbur. Without this, the whole plan is simply not going to work. Mage tried to be calm, but Rachel could have sensed anger in his voice. Gentle shuddering that could be noticed only by the most alert ears. And, by all means, her senses were definitely sharp enough to do so. So, we'll need to come up with something different, he said. I really cannot reveal myself, Wilbur, I can't. As Rachel sat with them, both she and Wilbur looked at Roland, whose head was tilted towards his mug now. He took the first sip, but his face did not turn any more bitter than it already was. He looked pretty down. What is going on, guys? She asked gently. To enter the realm of the city of Taraka, Wilbur uttered slowly. In short, to visit the unseen, I will need to perform a spell. Flesh magic spell, to be exact. I would need to transform the eyes of all of us. I would need to turn us blind. Physically blind. Like retarded? She raised her eyebrows. That was not in my contract. Temporarily, but here's the catch. As I am pretty confident that I will be able to manage to take off the spell from myself, what will be done? Your bodies are not accustomed to peculiarities of flesh magic. I'm afraid that, if not prepared properly, this change might happen to be permanent for you. That's why we'll need a piece of protection, presumably for all three of us, but in practice, at least for the two of you. She gave a look full of suspicion first at Roland, then at Wilbur. And what is that you require, my elven friend? She said in a deep voice, imitating Roland. Wilbur looked at him suddenly. We'll need the same material, that is being used for temple guards' robes. So, basically, their robe, or rather, just a piece of it. Cut it into 3 pieces and use them as blindfold for our eyes. Light magic it is enchanted with will protect our eyes from the change being permanent. I know what you expect from me, Roland said, irritated, but I told you already. My paladin days are over. My past is forgotten. I simply can't reveal myself to the temple. This might end in an unexpected way. That's not a problem, Rachel shrugged while sipping her beer. I can get it. Roland raised his head and frowned. That is a great risk, whatever you have in mind. You don't want to mess with the temple. Rachel laughed. Genuinely, honestly laughed. That must have been the very first time both Roland and Wilbur had seen her laughing. Silly you, she said. As if I didn't mess with the temple hard enough already. Mage and Paladin looked at each other surprised and smiled. They drank their beer, hating it greatly, and they spent, surprisingly, a great time at the tavern. Jokes and stories from their previous adventures filled the air, and they laughed. They laughed as hard as one should before visiting the world embraced with shadow, where the madness fills the streets, and blood and iron rules with cruelty. Rachel and Wilbur needed to drag Roland to his room, for he was barely able to stand on his feet. Stubborn Paladin, of course, came into the inn in his armor, which made things infinitely more difficult, but they managed to deliver him to his bed, and, with a loud grunt, they threw him on it, gasping for breath. Should we at least take his armor off? He shouldn't sleep in it, Wilbur was concerned. You do it, Rachel threw with a smile. You guys seem to have a thing. I don't want to witness that. She said that and left the room. Wilbur followed her and closed the door. You're not drunk, the mage noticed. Neither are you. She looked at him with her big, watchful eyes. Well, I am a wizard. Yeah. I know very well that you're using the flesh magic to drink with us. Probably you vomit all the beer you drink with us to the local plant pot or something. He was genuinely shocked. You don't think I'm stupid, don't you? That doesn't explain how you're holding up so well. She shrugged. Grew up in a wrong neighborhood, I guess. See you tomorrow in the sewers at the shrine you mentioned? Yes. Are you going to get this robe now? She nodded. Be careful, Rachel. You're very confident, but this is an extremely dangerous task. How do you plan to obtain it? I have my own ways, she smiled politely. Go throw up, mighty mage. I will see you tomorrow. Rachel went into the dirty streets of Auriel, where the scent of the dirty river that goes straight through it always filled her with disgust. This is where she grew up and lived all those years, but the smell always made her want to puke. Of course, neither Wilbur nor Roland knew that this is her home city. That's why she was renting the room in the local tavern, just like her 2 remaining companions, but this night she did not come back to it. She had a task to attend to. So instead, she walked the labyrinth of streets, taking way too long a route to reach her destination. Just in case she would be followed. Finally, she reached the wealthiest district, separated from the rest of the town by thick, tall walls. She had plenty of ways to sneak in and never get caught. While she was in, she found a big, white building and went in. In a matter of seconds, she was already in a bedroom with big, open windows and snow-white curtains dancing in the wind. A person was lying in the bed, reading. Always working, huh? She said while taking off her clothes. You should at least take a bath, Rachel. Woman laying in the bed said reluctantly. Nah, she responded lazily. I would be too much like you. She looked again at the book she was reading. Ever thought about reading something that is not religious bullshit? She never responded, and then she said in a serious tone, Victoria. She raised her eyes from above the book. So you came because you need something. Rachel looked at her, with her eyes filled with sadness while putting on fluffy pajamas. I need to work a lot, you know that well, so what is that you need? Her voice was serious, and it split her heart into two. This is the last quest that I'm doing for this Auriel guy. Then I'm taking the money and we can run away. You won't believe how much I made. We could run. She started to climb the bed, but Victoria stopped her by repeating her question. So, what do you need? In the temple office, you're responsible for equipping guards, right? She nodded. I will need one robe. Victoria was analyzing her, scanning her face, as if in this way she would find out more about what was happening. You will not tell me what you need it for, would you? She shook her head. Victoria sighed and said, Only if you promise that it's the last quest you're making for him. Rachel nodded vigorously with a big smile on her face. Then Victoria raised her arm and let her squeeze in. While she kept reading, Rachel fell asleep almost instantly. I can't believe that you need more candles than any temple I ever served in, Roland said while setting candles alight around the abandoned cultist shrine with a statue of a four-armed god. There is life in the fire, the life that can travel through dimensions, and we can use all the life we can in this lifeless realm. Rachel opened up the door and went in, holding a long golden robe in her arms. You got the whole one? Wilbur was astonished. She did not respond. Her face was sad, and she was definitely not in the mood. She also brought with herself silver scissors and, without a word, started to cut off pieces of clothes to create blindfolds for all three of them. Roland dealt with candles, and Wilbur finished drawing the runes on the floor with a piece of charcoal. In no time, all was ready. Good, he said in a neutral tone. Everybody ready? Except for a headache, I'm good, Roland said in a tired tone. Rachel nodded. Put these blindfolds on. I would perform the spell. Will it hurt? Rachel surprised Wilbur with that question. I'm afraid it will, he responded, and then all of them covered their eyes with a warm piece of cloth, vibrating with light magic. The only thing Rachel heard was Wilbur speaking Elvish, screaming spells and incantations. Then sound of the broken glass. Was there a glass in the room before? She didn't know. Weird squeaking. And then her eyes felt melting with fire. That lasted few incredibly long seconds, and then, despite the fact that her eyes were covered already, everything became much darker. And then colder. And then the sound of wind filled her ears, and she knew that she is no longer in the sewers under the city of Shorel. Wherever she was now, it was not the city she grew up in. It was not even the world that she knew. They entered the realm of darkness. Realm driven by madness and fueled by blood and iron. They arrived in hell. Thank you, dear listeners, for going on this stroll with me. Unfortunately, here we'll have to stop. Sit on a bench and feed some ducklings, maybe. That is so because this story does not end in here. And yet, we are not going to come back to it for some time. I was forced to split this quest in half, for it happened to be a long one. But I cannot forget that episodes of excavation for the impossible fluctuate between the past and the present. And as we witness Roland, Wilbur, and Rachel on another duty in their service for Auriel, 2 weeks from now, on another episode, there will be a time to dwell in the past once again. That is going to be the past of Rachel, the darkest piece of the heroic trio. And it's not going to be an easy one, especially for fragile hearts and empathic souls. There is a vast darkness luring in the world, and sometimes it reveals itself, forcing us to experience it. Rachel was not asked if she wants her life to be this tragic, so all the same, I am not going to ask myself if I want to explore it. I will obey to this story, and you, dear listeners, I sincerely hope in my heart you will listen to it too. Where this hope is coming from, you may ask. Hope of you joining me on this adventure? I think I know the answer, so I will share with you. I hope for your company, and this hope comes straight from my own fear of facing Rachel's shadow all by myself. Hope you're all well. I will see you in 2 weeks.